At the same time, we have seen this decline in American society, that simultaneously we have seen a decline in church attendance and religiosity broadly defined. I'm not arguing in the book that people need to go to a particular church, obviously. I love America's pluralism. What I'm saying is that if, in fact, we have a problem with American politics, to cite de Tocqueville and John Adams and many others, it probably reflects something that's going on in our communities, in our families, perhaps in our own interior lives.
Well, anybody who's been around conservative politics has heard of the Heritage Foundation. Thanks to the mainstream media's mischaracterization, they've probably heard of you and your work, Kevin, out in the middle of nowhere thanks to Project 2025. But we have a man here, Kevin Roberts, Dr. Kevin Roberts, who is the president of the Heritage Foundation, who has made heritage great again over the last 3 years. And he is the author of an interesting book, Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. And he's here to talk with us about that book. Kevin, welcome to Beyond the Polls.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. And I mean this, Henry, it's heartfelt. And also for your audience, you are my favorite political analyst and one of my favorite people on the planet, which doesn't mean that by saying that, I expect you to ask soft questions. One of the reasons you're my favorite is because you're so ruthlessly intellectually honest. And I just love it.
Well, thank you. Gee, can we put that somewhere on the blurb to the show, Perry? So let's just start with you. Unplug. Tell us what the book's thesis is. And take as long as you want. This is a podcast.
Oh, that's great, because as a recovering academic, I have a tendency to be long-winded. And then when you pair that with the fact that as a native Louisianan, I speak slower than people here in the Mid-Atlantic. It might take a little while.
Now, I thought it was Louisiana, and you're saying it's Louisiana, and I want to get it right when I'm down there.
It's Louisiana in that northern part of the state that my great friend Speaker Mike Johnson is from, but in my part of the state, which is around Interstate 10, the heart of Cajun country, we pronounce every syllable. It's Louisiana.
Yes. Well, the interesting data nerd fact, if you look at the Republican primary in Louisiana in 2008 between Mike Huckabee and John McCain, the county-by-county breakdown is an almost perfect representation of the Baptist versus Catholic split.
It sure is, and I remember that well, being very involved in that as a volunteer. Look, the thesis of the book, and thanks for asking, is that America's elites, their political elites in Washington, the financial elites in New York, have for too long run roughshod over the everyday American, and that the politics and ideology of American conservatism can once again address that and frankly arrest America's decline, reverse America's decline by devolving power from Washington, D.C. This is not a novel thesis, and it's not a surprise, I would think, for anyone in your audience to hear the president of the Heritage Foundation, whoever he or she would be, say that. Perhaps what's novel is that I try to weave into this book both a little bit of policy, federal and state level, as well as a little bit of personal anecdote, my own childhood, which like a lot of Americans was very difficult. Perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit, along with a real focus on things that are not governmental, on institutions. You know, at my heart, I'm a Burkean, and I believe one of the reasons that America is in decline is because our institutions have failed us, our institutions' leaders have failed us. But you also know, Henry, to talk about another thread in the book, that I am a man of deep faith, certainly practiced imperfectly, but deep faith. And I believe that in addition to my own spiritual faith, I have faith in everyday Americans to reclaim their institutions. And one thing that is novel about the book is that we have to be very aggressive in doing so. And so I try to lay this out in a way that reads reality truthfully, as I like to say, but also certainly has a spin that is hopeful about the American future.
Why did you write it? I mean, this is a book that you wrote and was published very shortly after the election. I don't believe any of your predecessors, well, Ed Fulner is famously the fourth president of the Heritage Foundation. I honestly don't know about the first three, but the next three, I don't believe any of them wrote a book while being president of the Heritage Foundation. So you are an innovator in that respect. Why did you write it, and why did you choose right after the presidential, to write it so that it would come out right after a consequential presidential election?
Part of revitalizing institutions, including heritage, is being willing as a leader to be bold in planting a flag and to step into the intellectual arena where you and I spend quite a bit of time often together. I believe that we're at this crossroads, not just in America, but in the conservative movement, between the final days, months, years, perhaps, of the old fusionism, of which heritage was a part proudly, and what I call a new fusionism, which is, roughly speaking, a fusion of populism and conservatism. And I thought it was very important that, in addition to the great work my colleagues do in public policy at the federal and state level, that I step back into a role that I used to have, which was more academic. I was a history professor, and
the president of a college.
That's right, and fuse those things and be willing to take the risk, both personally, but also on behalf of us as an institution, to chart a path. And it doesn't mean, of course, that everything that I say in there is necessarily going to come true, or that we're emotionally tied to it, as much as to say, to acknowledge that we at Heritage, one of the very important institutions on the right, I say that with no hubris, we believe that America is at this crossroads, and that if we aren't very intentional about how we recohere the conservative movement, we're going to be fighting the wars, whether they be literal military wars or political wars of the last decades rather than the 2020s and the 2030s.
So, before we get onto your book, I do want to challenge you just a little bit on the Heritage Foundation, which is to say that prior to your presidency, no one would have doubted that Heritage stood for free trade, small government, traditional moral values, robust internationalism. Heritage has some reinterpretation of some of those things. And why do you think Heritage has done some more rethinking on your watch? And to what extent, when you talk about the old fusionism, was the old and the needing to get on from 1980, to what extent was the old fusionism in part to cause for the uniparty to come to power, as you talk about? Not an intentional cause, but an unintentional cause of the uniparty assuming its position of dominance.
Well, the first and most important factor in Heritage updating our proposed policy solutions for longstanding problems is the reality in the United States and across the conservative movement, which is this. I lament it, by the way, but it is this. This country, best as I can tell, best as we can measure at Heritage, is weaker in almost every measure, socioeconomically, militarily, educationally, in 2025 than it was in 1980. I'm not a declinist. I believe this is reversible. But at Heritage, we understand the world around us. And so with 300 great people, most of them policy scholars, assessing this, it moved us to the second point, which is, in spite of all the success that Heritage has had because of my colleagues and my predecessors, to develop culturally, like inside Heritage, the humility to say that on an issue like China, on which, like everyone else who was a conservative, myself included, Heritage thought we were going to be able to turn China into the next America, to say, you know what, we were wrong about that 15 or 20 years ago. It was well-intentioned. The research was fantastic. And our process of doing that is so transparent internally because of our famous one voice policy that I invited my friend and mentor, Dr. Ed Follner, to have a conversation with me at an all-staff meeting about China. And it was Ed, with his just inimitable virtue, who said, look, Heritage had the best of intentions in saying that the free market, for example, was going to turn China into the next America. But what's happened in terms of reality since then, over the last 15 or 20 years, is that China's taken advantage of us. And so I think that's just one example, perhaps the most significant one, in which Heritage's own process, I would like to think its own virtuous culture as an organization, led us to say, look, we've got to do some updated thinking here. And also, I happen to be, just to speak about perhaps my own role in this, I happen to know well the philosophy of Wilmore Kendall, who, as you know, for decades talked about the very natural long-running fusion between populism in its best form and conservatism. And so I don't see the tension there that some friends in the movement do, although I recognize that improperly applied, there might be a tension there. And the last thing is, Heritage is so different from most other think tanks. In fact, we don't even use that phrase internally to describe ourselves, because while our research is of academic quality, the reason we do that is to be able to effect policy change at the federal level and the state level. And so there is a certain connection that we at Heritage have, not just with reality, but with the everyday American. And the everyday American's feeling a lot of pain because of really bad policy decisions, and we're very close to them. We reflect that.
Well, one of the things that struck me about your book is when you're talking about what's needed to change America, to save America, and you talk about burning down institutions. And you give a list, and some of them are public institutions, and a lot of them are private institutions. The first one you start off with in a list on page 2 is every Ivy League college. What does it mean to burn down an institution in your mind? I know you're not advocating arson. Okay, so let's get that out of the way.
Some of your journalist colleagues of a different political persuasion have accused me of that. I do like campfires, but I'm not an arsonist. I mean it figuratively. And I came up with that idea, for what it's worth, as an avid outdoorsman, which you know about me, and living in the Rocky Mountain West, leading Wyoming Catholic College, and therefore every summer realizing that one of the many failed policies of the federal government was not conducting controlled burns of the forest, and therefore far more important than climate change, even if someone believes that humans have had a major impact on climate, which I don't. We have all these forest fires. And so I said, what can I do in terms of a literary device to make this book less academic and apply that to the institutional change that needs to happen? That's one thread. The second thread, just bear with me for one more minute on this. I am, to invoke a name that maybe not everyone in your audience is familiar with, a devotee of John Senior's work. John Senior was a humanities professor at the University of Kansas. He started the integrated humanities program. He was someone who actually did believe that American culture was in decline and it might not quite be reversible. I'm more of an optimist than him, but the college that I led is a sort of a second generation of John Senior's work, in fact, founded by a couple of his students. And those two things came together in this sense that I think America's institutions writ large have become rotten, and they have become rotten for a number of reasons. But to the heart of your question, what I mean when I say burning them down is either the boards and the customers, if you will, the students and families of these Ivy League colleges, for example, need to put pressure on those institutions to get them to implement their mission again, or we just need to forget about them. And forgetting about them, of course, means that it will take several years for an Ivy League institution with a $33 billion endowment to go anywhere. But I'm much more fond, evidenced by my own career in founding a K-12 school, running an upstart college, of starting new institutions that increasingly take market share from those others. I think Hillsdale College, although not new, its profound impact on the American public square in the last generation under Larry Arnn's leadership is new. And I think we need to see that as an example of the kind of model of how you take over institutions or just crowd them out with market share of better ones.
Okay, so in that sense, Harvard doesn't need to worry about torch-burning heritage devotees marching up onto Harvard Yard. What they need to worry about is heritage devotees with the torch burning in their heart setting up new Harvards.
That is exactly right, along with my colleagues who are great torchbearers when it comes to public policy, advising Congress as we speak, that if Harvard wants to continue to take federal money through research grants and lop off 64% before even giving it to professor awardees, if they want to continue to participate in Title IV student loans and grants while they have a $35 billion endowment, some things have to change.
Yeah, in other words, what you're advocating is using the weapons that are before you. One of the things that can be laid at the feet of the old fusionism is the argument that, well, we shouldn't be using government power to advance our norms, given that that's what we criticize the left. What we want to do is remove government from the norm structure. But of course, they didn't repeal those entitlements. They didn't repeal those loan programs and so forth. And what you're saying is, no, we're in a war. And if somebody leaves a tank on the battlefield and you know how to run it, you ought to shoot it at your enemy.
That's right. And I cite some examples in the book. I think that Ron DeSantis's governorship in Florida is an excellent example of a very aggressive, conservative governor using all of his legal and constitutional authority. And if there are questions about one or two of those programs, I have full faith in the system of shared governance across the three branches of getting it right. And I use the image in the book, as you know, of a hurricane. I mean, I grew up 18 miles due north of what is now the Gulf of America, and have lived through a lot of hurricanes, most of them minor, a couple of them major. And the way I use this image is that I believe firmly that most of the time politics is downstream from culture. But in my hometown, it was very common in a hurricane coming due north through the Gulf that the bayou that runs through Lafayette, Louisiana, the Vermilion Bayou, the Vermilion River, would sometimes reverse course because of the wind. And my point is that's politics sometimes affecting our culture. And by the way, I'm a newcomer to that. I didn't really think as recently as 6 or 7 or 8 years ago that was possible. That is, for politics to influence culture. And I think that, I mean, not that I'm special or, different or smarter than anybody else, but my thought is if I, as a longtime devotee of the old fusionism, can come to grips with some of these difficult realities in the new politics, I think it's possible for anybody.
So one of the things that struck me when reading your book is you would expect the president of the Heritage Foundation to talk about politics because, of course, Heritage Foundation is based in Washington. Its primary audience historically, it has a large audience out in the hinterlands, the flyover country, the bayous, the prairies, but its focus has always been changing hearts and minds within the Beltway. But you actually seem to give a primacy to what you call a spiritual war rather than the political war. Tell me what the difference is and why winning the war for defining within your heart, within your mind, what it is to be good, just, true, beautiful, and American is more important than winning the political war, even though both are important.
They're both important, and the very brief context to the answer to your question is that we have to make Washington less important. So even if we're just being willing to fight in the political sphere, we have to recognize that and revitalize federalism. But as I was writing this book, I came to appreciate there is a much deeper war, if you will, and it's the spiritual war that you speak of. And that's going to look differently for different people depending upon, where they're from and where they go to church, if they go to church at all. But is sort of the point, which is that it's not a coincidence in my mind or in the analysis of a lot of my colleagues that at the same time we have seen this decline in American society, that simultaneously we have seen a decline in church attendance and religiosity broadly defined. I'm not arguing in the book that people need to go to a particular church, obviously. I love America's pluralism. What I'm saying is that if in fact we have a problem with American politics, to cite de Tocqueville and John Adams and many others, it probably reflects something that's going on in our communities, in our families, perhaps in our own interior lives. And starting with myself as the example, not casting stones from my glass house, I say that part of this renewal of the United States, if in fact we are living in a golden era, as President Trump likes to say, that we have to start with a spiritual renewal. And if that's perhaps a bridge too far for some people who fashion themselves agnostic, then let's at least start with the renewal of our dinner tables. That is to say, conversation around our dinner tables to revitalize our families, our household. They're going to look a little bit different than they did, or a lot different than they did a generation or two ago. But it's that interpersonal connection between Americans that really is something about our spirit, even if it's not necessarily explicitly religious, that I think we need to be attending to. So much of the book is really about non-Washington things in communities that you've never heard of, people that maybe you've heard of, but looking at their success from a little bit different angle.
How do you win that spiritual war? I mean, it's not that for the last 30 years there haven't been people with prominent pulpits, media sources preaching about a return to religious life or talking about things. But yet, as you noted, although a new Pew poll that came out this morning shows that Christianity is no longer in decline as far as its professed faith among the percentage of Americans. It certainly is nowhere near as having risen, that we've kind of got a stasis of about 73% of people who declare some religion and 27% who say none or disbelief in religion. And of course, we know about the decline in wedlock births, raising of the marriage age, and all of teenage depression on the rise and so forth. It's not like people haven't been talking about it, but yet you get the sense that a number of people heard the argument and decided the other side had a better argument. So what is it that you think has to change in order to win the spiritual war, and what role does politics have to play? Because that arguably is one thing that was missing over the last 30 years, is people using the bully pulpit of public office to continually drive some of these arguments home.
Apropos of the image of the Vermilion River flowing northward, away from the Gulf of America, then into it, as I mentioned in the book, and that is to say that I think the reason that we're seeing the arresting of this decline of religiosity in the near term is because more elected officials, or more broadly, Henry, people in the public eye, including some athletes of all different kinds of ethnic backgrounds and religious backgrounds, are professing their faith or speaking about faith. I'll leave it up to other Americans how they want to do that. It really is our central freedom. But they're doing that, witnessing, if you will, I think has been a big part of that. These are people who are admired for other reasons. Just look at President Trump, for example. He is a man who would tell you publicly, and he and I have talked about this privately, that about faith, who would tell you, he's not the most faithful or person who believes most in sort of organized religion, but he's someone who understands the importance of that to the American ethos. And I dare say that the start of his second term, it really reflects that. So politics plays a role. Policy might reflect or play a role. But the two more important things, I think, are institutions and individuals. Our institutions, starting with our various organized churches, have to be more courageous in professing what they see to be the truth. That is, implementing their mission, if you will. In my case, as a serious Roman Catholic, I encourage my bishop friends to be more vocal, not about politics per se, but about what is their moral obligation. They will answer to our Lord on their judgment day, and that is the formation of our souls, that they ought not be timid. People are going to disagree with them, but speak the truth, and then let the chips fall where they may. But that leads me to the final, most important point, and that is, and I talk about this a lot in the book, what we choose to do as individuals. Obvious virtuous decisions. I think the vast majority of Americans are virtuous people, but to share that with people in a way that's appropriate in the workplace and so on. But I think I see that just on Capitol Hill, especially among younger Americans. I'm half a century old. Most of the people I work with at Heritage are younger than I am, and almost all of them have a much more serious faith than I think most folks in my generation and Generation X do. So I'm very hopeful about it.
One of the things you talk about sports. I watch a fair amount of sports. Usually, I will watch English soccer, and aside from American football players talking about their faith, or coaches, baseball player hits home run, he points to the heaven. England, I see Muslim players come onto the field and they raise their hands in what is only interpreted as a gesture of faith. I see players from secular Sweden coming on what can only be described as the sign of a cross. They make it so quickly it's not clear they're getting the right shoulder. But I mean, I don't know what else they're doing.
There's something happening out there. It really is astounding. I spent a lot of time in the UK, as you know, because Heritage is very involved in the conservative movement there. And I was there recently, and along the lines of what you're saying, I spoke about this very conversation thread you and I are having about the intertwining of politics and faith in the United States. And one of my British friends came up and said, I wish I had your faith, or more accurately, I wish I had your courage. I think it's courage to speak about faith out in the open. We just don't in Britain. I actually think that's going to change too.
Time to get ready for spring at this year's Chantilly Boat Show. 15 dealers offering huge discounts on current stock at this sales event. Boats for every lifestyle, every budget. Got a trade? With plenty of free parking, bring it in and make your best deal. They're rigged and ready for fun, so get on board. The Chantilly Boat Show opens March 7th, Dulles Expo Center. Details at vaboatshows.com.
Life is better with a boat.
Let me ask you, one of the things you write about is what you call the permanent things. I could sit there and recite it for people from your writings, but, that's really boring and it's top down. I'd like you, sua sponte, to tell my listeners, what are the permanent things that you write about in your book?
Oh, and you want me to do so succinctly? What a challenge.
Oh, no, this is a podcast. You can go on and on and on.
I'll try not to. I don't want to bore them. The permanent things, which, as a phrase, I guess does sound a little boring. The permanent things are these eternal principles, ideals that are imprinted on our nature. I would argue imprinted on our soul, but for my agnostic or atheist friends, they're imprinted on our nature. People may have heard of natural law. It's those ideals that go into understanding that. And precisely, coming from this liberal arts guy, I would argue capital T truth, which we know when we wake up, our first sense of consciousness when we're toddlers or young adults. Goodness, which is profoundly apparent all over this country. And beauty, which is, for a couple of generations, not been as profoundly apparent. Reflected in brutalist architecture in what should be the greatest capital city in the history of the world, Washington, D.C., reflected in a pretty coarse musical culture. I don't mean that so much as a prude. I like country and Western music, and some of the lyrics are pretty dumb. But the point is to say, we know in our souls and our natures that we are wired to these things that transcend us. They transcend our politics, certainly our two-party system. They transcend even nation-state borders. They are what define us as humans. And every human has these. Every human has access to these. And so my appeal to the permanent things is to appeal to our humanity for the purpose of reminding everyone that the reason we want to organize ourselves politically, civically, and so on is to revitalize self-governance and that hardwired freedom to be responsible for ourselves, but in community with people in our neighborhood, maybe even people in a far-flung country geographically like the United States, is what makes us truly happy in the way that supernatural joy can be described.
So to be pithy and mundane, what's true in Kansas is true in Kiribati.
Oh, man, that's why you're the best.
So I have to say, on the news of country music, my favorite country music song is Garth Brooks' Papa Loves Mama. And why is it that? It's got a catchy tune, it's got a nice lyric, and it's about cheating and killing. Papa loves mama, mama loves man, mama's in the graveyard, papa's in the pen. Okay. So
I'm going to be hearing that in my head for the next 2 days.
Well, you should. Everybody needs to have the chorus to Papa Loves Mama imprinted on their head. This is, Papa's a bad dude. Mama's a bad dude. But Garth knows that they're both bad dudes who were good people doing bad things, and they got their comeuppance in the end, which is perhaps how country music differs from other popular music.
Yeah, the justice is served in almost every case. And I am, as actually you may not know, I'm a huge country and Western aficionado.
Oh, shock me.
Yeah, right. And often I bore my wife, poor thing, with this reality, or talking about this reality of how perfect so many country songs are. But it is I think it's a distinctive, if not unique, genre that way.
So let me just press you a little bit on the permanent things, because in your book you write about a couple of things that could be interpreted as not permanent or doctrinaire or in some way revolutionary. You talk about marrying for life and somebody could look at that and say, does that mean that the Heritage Foundation thinks we should repeal 1960s era no-fault divorce and go back to the fault era of divorce that characterized divorce for most of our country? You say people are made to worship, and that America's society is rooted in Christian faith, and that public policy should not be afraid to push in that direction. Then somebody could say, well, what does that mean about I'm Muslim and I'm sitting here in Lafayette, Louisiana, and suddenly I have to be told to read the Bible in class or have public mandatory prayer in schools, which was in fact what happened before Abingdon School District in 1962. I throw those out at you to say, how would you respond to your critics who might say, that's not, these are doctrinal things. These aren't the permanent things. These are, in fact, things that come only from certain traditions, and that the American movement away from them is a good thing.
Yeah, a great and fair question, and I love this conversation thread, as you know. The first is, well, they are the permanent things. I think that's indisputable. It is an ideal, even though it's very difficult for many people, in the case of my own parents who divorced when I was 4, for people to have one spouse their entire lives. So two things can be true at once. On the one hand, that it's the ideal. In fact, it's the aspiration of most humans to spend their life in a romance with one other adult. There are exceptions to that culturally and so on. But in the United States and throughout the West, that's been the ideal. The fact that, to state the other thing that's true, that whether someone believes through original sin or bad choices or just incompatibility, that doesn't always happen, is not to say that somehow people who are divorced are second-class citizens. To your question about the no-fault divorce, there's a whole body of scholarship outside Heritage, but a little bit inside Heritage, that there are some unintended consequences through the no-fault divorce laws. We're focused on some other policy priorities, but I think you get the point that you can acknowledge the ideal on the one hand and also acknowledge that all of us are humans, certainly starting with me. But the second point about Muslims reading the Bible, yeah, they ought to. They ought to, because this is a Christian country, not a Muslim country. It can be true to say that and also say we owe all of the respect legally and even, in my mind, even more importantly, socially, to people of all religious backgrounds, whether they be Muslims or whether they be people of no faith. But it is a rejection of the cultural inheritance that's important for every American who woke up in this place today, for them to reject learning about one of the key, I would argue, the most important parts of our canon, which is the Bible.
So let me press you a little bit on that, because there are parts in your book where you talk about, on the one hand, America being a Christian country by heritage, and you just reiterated that, but you also talk about it's more important that people have a belief than necessarily the substance of that belief. Could America be America if, because of immigration, migration, or whatever, we became a Buddhist country or a Muslim country or a Jewish country rather than a Christian country? Or is America not just historically tied to Christianity, but uniquely tied to Christianity?
No, we couldn't have an America if it was dominated by those religions, and that's not to be disrespectful toward either those religions or certainly the people who adhere to them. In fact, quite the opposite. The point is that it's only, ironically, fittingly, uniquely, it's only because of America's founding, with the intertwining of Christian beliefs, that there is this tolerance for these other faiths. And as I mentor my own children, hopefully effectively, our devout Christianity or attempt at devout Christianity doesn't mean that we disrespect people of other faiths. Quite the opposite. It ought to make us models, I would hope, for loving those. I think most Americans agree with that. But to say, therefore, as is in the premise of your great devil's advocate question, that we could just upend all of that and have the same thing doesn't necessarily follow.
So this is a question that is meant to be as much needling as it is serious. But you do say, you talk about the permanent things, and you say Catholic faith, Acadian sense of family, Texan nationality, American sense of work, which is, I know you, that happens to be you. To borrow from Selena Zito, should we take you literally or should we take you seriously?
About
in other words, this gets to the question, one could say, well, what about the Brahmin Hindu sense of family? How does that differ? You have a wonderful Alamo flag on your wall. Well, what about the New England townships what about the New England sense of nationality? What is it that you find in those four things that are the permanent things? What is it that distills them into permanence so that you don't have to be a Catholic, you don't have to be an Acadian, you don't have to be a Texan, you can have other experiences, but you come into contact with the same truths?
I love the needling, and I love the fact that it's a very serious question. And just for the sake of your audience, the way I attempt to employ those attributes about me and many other people is just by example. That is to say that America is such a special place that this guy who, to the surprise of some people, grew up in a divorced family. My brother committed suicide when he was 15 and I was 9 because of generational alcoholism in my family, which is unfortunately not uncommon among Cajun families. That this place is where the American dream can still be alive, to state the obvious. J.D. Vance, of course, has a somewhat similar story. But to the examples that you mentioned, I tried to use those examples of growing up where I did and my fondness for Texas national identity to say that there are many other examples, almost countless examples around the country, whether they be regional or religious or something else, that ought to create the same sense of national pride. And I think that J.D. Vance said it really well in his acceptance speech in Milwaukee last July, with echoes of Buchanan's speech in 1992, which is that America is not an idea. It's a place. It's a place where we're born, or a place where we arrive, hopefully legally, and become citizens. And it's a place where we will all die, where we will be buried, where our bones will turn to dust. And that's true for someone of a different faith from a different region as it is for me and my kids. That is what makes America so special, is our profound understanding of nation as place, in spite of all of the different ways that we're different, all of our pluralism. There's been no society that I can think of that has attempted this experiment with the success that we've had.
I mean, America is an interesting case study because, on the one hand, the thing that brings America into existence as a nation, as opposed to English colonies, is an act that is represented by a declaration, which is a statement of ideas. But you can't read those ideas in Korea and say, I'm an American. Although, you could read the Bible in Korea and say, I am a Christian, but you can't read the idea and be truthful a Christian, but you can't read the ideas in Korea and say you're American. You have to participate in the life of an American, which means you have to be in a place. You have to understand a culture, not sense of words. So it's ideas in action reinforced by law and borders. Would that be a fair statement as to...
In fact, it's perfectly eloquent, and I would add to that the following. The almost countless local communities, obviously there's a finite number, but the local communities with their own mores, their own traditions, some of them because of ethnic immigration patterns, but sometimes just because of where they are, because they're mountain towns or ocean towns. America's filled with those. There are other countries that have those too, but they don't have this combination of ingredients as you laid out so eloquently. So
a final question is, why are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful for 3 reasons. Top of the head. The first is my faith. I know that however difficult this life may be for any of us, that we win in the end, which sounds a little sarcastic, but I mean that. There's going to be some redemptive suffering along the way in many respects for every human. The second is almost as important.
You just demonstrated that you're not a Calvinist in theology, but go ahead.
I did. I mean, try to be consistent.
Yeah. No, tulip Catholicism does not exist.
That's right. The second is almost as important as my religious faith. I'm so grateful for this country. And I believe that in spite of all of its warts, challenges that will persist for a while, that this country, because of its people, because of its institutions, because of so many of its leaders, hopefully that will continue on both sides of the ideological spectrum. I have faith in them, and we're going to get some things wrong, but we're going to get most of them right. And then the third is very anecdotal. The younger generations. I think about my kids' generation. I think about the generation of 60% of my Heritage colleagues who are under the age of 35, young men and women I encounter on Capitol Hill of all faiths and no faith. They believe in authenticity, and they believe that the American dream can be revitalized if America's leaders, political and religious and otherwise, are authentic about the challenges we confront and authentic about the solutions that can fix them or at least play a role in fixing them. I'm actually more hopeful about the American future since I've arrived in the Washington, D.C. area, because the people you might least expect to have that optimism live it out every day.
Oh, Kevin, everyone knows where to find the Heritage Foundation and your work. Where can they follow you?
Well, once you have looked at all of the great work of my colleagues at heritage.org, you can follow me best on X at Kevin Roberts TX.
TX, not Texas.
Yeah, I'm an adopted Texan. If we didn't live in Northern Virginia, we would be back in our adopted hometown of Austin, Texas. My friends and family in Lafayette, Louisiana know that. We love Louisiana, but we are adopted Texans and, of course, love where we are now. But holding on to that TX handle.
Yeah, well, I'm going to assume that you have the optimism of Colonel Bowie at the end of the Alamo, whose final words in his letter were victory or death. I'm going to assume that that death part is out of the Heritage equation. It's victory.
That is correct. Victory, period.
Well, Kevin, as usual, it is a delight to chat with you. Thank you for making time in your busy schedule to join me, and I'm sure my listeners thank you for joining me on Beyond the Polls.
Thanks, Henry. I've never had a conversation with you in which I didn't learn something, didn't get appropriately pressed and politely, and in which I did not enjoy it.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph Fonsbakowski. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.